Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability, climate change and beyond. We have an absolutely fantastic discussion coming up today with Marianne Wilkinson, and one of Australia's leading journalists, who won the Walkley Prize twice, which is the top award you can win in that world, and Blair Palese from 350.org, the chair there and involved with a whole series of other things which we'll hear about today. Just as a very brief introduction to all of this, we've often heard people talk about climate change and climate science being a religion or something uncertain. And of course, students of history will know that Joseph Fourier established that the Earth was a bit hotter than it ought to be, given how far away it was from the sun in the 1820s or 1830s, and identified that if you change the insulating layer around the Earth a bit, then the temperature of the Earth should change a bit. Now, I learned this from someone who was chairman of Shell shortly before he reminded me of this bit of schoolboy physics, so it's a useful thing to keep in mind. The world has moved on, but some of the arguments have not. The other thing I was just going to share is almost 50 years ago now, a book called Limits to Growth was published based on some models as to what would happen. There's a wonderful segment which we showed a clip of in that trailer from an ABC segment about this, which paraphrasing said, everything really will start to get difficult about the year 2020. Just as a couple of things we're talking about, of course, all emissions here, we will probably have a particular focus on CO2, but it's very much about all of those emissions. And of course, a big slice of those come from energy. This is the composition of the energy part of those emissions, which is the largest part of the total. A lot comes from electricity, a lot comes from transport, some comes from manufacturing and construction. So with all that as background, I'm going to invite Blair and Marianne and Paul to join us now on our virtual stage. And to say, firstly, thank you so much all for being here. And I'm going to start directly with Marianne to say, an awful lot of water has flown under the bridge. All sorts of strange things have happened along the time. She's recently published this book, The Carbon Club, which, as you can see, there's a lot of horrifying things in here. I know many of the people in this book. And so when you read the stories, it's pretty galling. But kind of, where are we now? What's happening now, with all that water under the bridge?
Nigel, it's fascinating to watch it from an Australian perspective right now, because I've been carefully monitoring our Prime Minister's speeches over the last little while. And indeed, in his rather famous speech here a little while ago this year, he came very haltingly to the idea of net zero emissions, preferably, as he put it, by 2020. And I sort of was a bit taken aback by this, that he'd finally made that step. But suddenly, of course, he, straight after those words, fired off this sort of volley of qualifications. We couldn't do this without large advances in technology. We couldn't do this with carbon taxes or carbon prices, or basically anything that would cost us anything. Now, that was just weeks ago. Yesterday, when he was at the Australian Financial Review Business Summit, our Prime Minister was suddenly talking about the new geopolitics of energy and climate change. And quite frankly, I'm putting that down not to business pressure just yet. I'm putting that down to the heat the Australian government has been feeling in the last few weeks from President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And I think what's happening this year is incredibly exciting in geopolitics, and quite exciting for us in Australia.
And maybe just to put this a little bit in the global context, I'm going to ask Blair this question, because we talked a bit about this geopolitics in our election special back in November time, and again at the beginning of the year with Jigar Shah, who since then has now been appointed to the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office to run that. So very gratifying to see some very smart people and very commercial people going into these roles. But From a global perspective, Blair, why does Australia matter so much in all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nigel. Biggest exporter of coal and gas. So let's just park it there. I mean, depending on when you're measuring, we top the list first or second in both coal exports and natural gas. Currently, really no plan for rolling that export worldview back and considering what happens next to our economy. So if you look at the challenges of, say, how you begin to try and talk to Indonesia about ending exporting of coal, when you've got a developed country like Australia with every opportunity to move on to other things and do it well and transition with good time in a conservative way that helps people, communities, and the economy, but refusing to do it because the fossil fuel industry and the Murdoch media hold our government literally in the palm of their hands and tell them what to do. Now, just my little idea of the week that I've been thinking, kind of ruminating on, wouldn't it be ironic if things like carbon border taxes begin to kick in? Now, EU, Japan, and the US are all looking at a carbon border tax concept, which would mean that any country that whatever doesn't fit the bill for action on climate change begins to have to pay significantly more in a tax or whatever way they want to kind of put it in place. Wouldn't it be amazing if the mining industry is the one breathing down Scott Morrison's neck shortly to say, this will impact our exports to a point where we can't afford to be competitive, iron ore, coal, gas, whatever. You better figure out how to put a net zero plan in place. It's quite possible that this is the case. So why is Australia so interesting? I think it's this funny example of the last of the developed world to get its head around, it just makes good economic sense, let alone climate sense, and to figure out how to play the politics at home in such a way that it can deliver that and show the public that it's the right thing to do after decades of denying that it's a real issue.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because in the US there have been more voices that have been speaking out strongly in favor of some of this action. In Australia, you've had a number of the biggest organizations, so companies like Westpac, the bank, National Australia Bank, BHP, and a few others, who signed up to support the Corporate Leaders Group on Climate Change initiative in the UK and Europe. This is the Prince of Wales thing, launched in about 2003, but they've barely whispered about it in Australia. It's been very convenient in one part of the world and very uncomfortable in another. And the leading business body in Australia, or certainly one of them, the Business Council of Australia, has, of course, really fought the same battle for nothing to happen. And then suddenly something changed. And I don't know, Marion, if you can cast some light on that, because it's as if someone woke up one day and said, you know what, let's just get a different story. Let's wear a different suit. I find it quite bizarre having watched it from a distance.
It is bizarre, Nigel, and I think the flipping of the Business Council of Australia is one of the most interesting stories that has happened here. We had a very toxic 2019 election. Once again, climate change was a super toxic issue, as it is in the US at election times. There were extraordinary campaigns run in regional Australia, especially Queensland and Western Australia, the big mining states. And there were all these rather unbelievable lines put out in the campaign. If people bought electric vehicles, for example, they wouldn't be able to go on camping trips. Tradesmen wouldn't be able to carry their tools because electric vehicles were so hopeless, but these would be forced on you by a Labor government. That was the tenor of the election campaign.
And of course, the Ioniq 5's just been launched with this wonderful 90-second video about how you can use it to electrify your camping experience and a whole bunch of other things.
I know, super ironic. But before that election, the Business Council of Australia, in fact, the head of the Business Council of Australia, made some very impolitic remarks that were leaked to the press about Labor's targets to cut emissions being, quote, economy-wrecking targets, which caused enormous pain for Labor in that pre-election period. Now, suddenly, we've got the Business Council here signing up to net zero emissions. And I have to say, I think one of the forces, certainly the banks are becoming a real force. They've found their voice on the Business Council. But Mike Cannonbrooks, one of our more interesting entrepreneurs, is having a huge influence here. He's basically a tech guy, super wealthy, who has really got into the space on renewable energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike Cannonbrook's one of the two founders of Atlassian. They managed to build this business, get it listed in the US, and the two founders still have about 70% of the equity in a company that's market cap is something in the order of 40 to 50 billion US dollars. And Mike in particular has been incredibly forceful in getting on board and driving change in a whole series of areas. So let's just keep talking about billionaires for a moment, and maybe talk also Andrew Forrest and what he's been doing.
Yeah. Can I jump
well, of course.
on one tiny
go
bit,
ahead,
Mary,
Blair.
and then you take over. The Boyer speech lecture was just transformational in the sense of what it indicates in the thinking of those thinking bigger picture about where industry is going to go. And now the biggest poster child for ramping up massive renewable energy to how we can make green hydrogen for industrial use. The thing that was most interesting to me about that speech was his trip that he took for 6 or 8 months prior to kind of doing the speech and talking about it, which was not to tourist locations. It was to Tajikistan, Africa, Afghanistan. I just did a story on the whole, his speech and what it indicates for Climate and Capital Media, which, clearly he's looking at the need to set up large scale, massive renewables in developing countries, in some of the more desperate war-torn parts of the world, who would welcome anyone coming in with an idea for how to help their economy, as the way to ramp up really rapidly on massive renewable energies. And then potentially making it the spot where you go to produce iron ore or other products. That's a pretty revolutionary idea for an Australian in a country where the government doesn't even acknowledge climate change. So you have to see how the divergence of business thinking has happened here, but on a global scale as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Marianne, particularly given that same kind of dynamic in the States of being held back by the government for the last 4 years and longer, to really think, kind of take the holds off and think big scale on where this is going. If that same kind of transformational thinking is happening with, sure, we've got fossil fuels trying to continue the tobacco campaign of, to slow down and obfuscate, but business people would not be so stupid as to be led by that in the States, I think, and they're certainly not doing it here anymore.
Well, I think you're right, Blair, but I think that incredible tension is now coming to a head in Australia. And Twiggy Forrest's turnaround on this, as you rightly say, is incredibly influential. And of course, one of the fascinating things is that Twiggy Forrest has also invested with Mike Cannonbrooks in this extraordinary venture in Northern Australia called Sun Cable. With this idea, I think the kind of exciting idea behind it is exporting renewable energy to Asia from Northern Australia. Now, whether it comes off or not, I don't know, but the fact that these two people, Cannonbrooks, who's coming from one end of the business spectrum, who's always been very adventurous in this area, with Twiggy Forrest, who's traditionally been part of that conservative mining entrepreneurial bloc with the Minerals Council, etc. Here, that is what is really interesting. That is what is changing. But I think, as Bill McKibben's written in the US, and I think it's happening here, at the same time, there's a real feeling, especially from the gas industry here, that we have to draw a line in the sand. We have to dig in. We have to preserve what we can of the fossil fuel industry. And I think there will be enormous pressure from the gas industry, even more than the coal industry, to hold the line on things like larger emissions reduction targets.
It's fascinating, and I'm going to come back to you in a second, Blair, because of course you know Bill from your work with 350.org. The real challenge, I think, for the corporate sector is, for oil and gas, is it's really hard to hold back the change when some of the change can be driven by individuals just deciding, you know what, I want cheaper electricity and I'm going to put those solar panels on my roof. I actually want the functionality of an electric car. I'm just going to buy an electric car and I'm going to buy renewable energy. And that sort of momentum is really building. And I know one thing that's been important in this is Mike Cannonbrook has been closely involved with the RE100 initiative, which is a global initiative getting large companies to sign up, including a whole series of very big name businesses, to support to shift to 100% renewable energy within typically quite short timeframes, 5 years. They've even got, I think, a zinc smelter in Australia now committed to go net zero by 2040. Once you have the corporate sector doing that, is it really going to be that easy to fight back against that if you're oil and gas? And I'm going to let Marion answer that in a moment. But first, Blair, how does all this play out for the activists out there that are really trying to drive change? And what should they be doing?
Yeah, focusing on gas for front and center, and that same investor kind of pressure around divestment of coal should have shifted 5 years ago to gas, because you could see the transition from the industry push from coal to, hey, we can still sell gas, as the kind of language used, natural gas is a classic little phrase, trying to pretend it's not polluting or it's not a greenhouse gas, is everywhere, rampant around the world, but it's been particularly strong here in Australia. So financing of gas is a risk, because to now put money into that kind of infrastructure is locking yourself into decades of fossil fuels that, look, COP is breathing down our necks. The world, the UK has decided this is its thing, and it's going to deliver on the world stage, potentially in a legacy sense post-Brexit, to prove that it can do something in the world on its own 2 feet and not as part of the EU. That's a pretty powerful force to be taking on, in the sense that they see this as kind of a make or break branding country issue for them. They're going hard on all countries of the world to turn up in November ready to commit to significant leaps ahead. Gas is not in that agenda. It's not in the UK's perspective at all. They don't benefit in any way. They don't have a big connection to the gas industry. So to think that little Australia is going to hold back, push the world and say gas is still great, let's keep doing it, is as unrealistic as it was with coal. So activists everywhere, plus those working on things like shareholder activism, will be pushing the pure play gas companies, but also pushing investors and those who really have been continuing the legacy of investment into gas infrastructure, to say that's got to end. It just doesn't fit in the carbon budget that we have.
By the way, just to those, I know we've got people watching on YouTube as well, please do hit the like button and share this with more people, so more people get to hear some of this fascinating discussion. Now come back to Marion to say, we know that these forces will fight back. So there's a lot, we've seen this play out in oil and gas and coal. We've obviously seen similar things play out in other areas to do with the natural environment and to do with smoking. How are they going to try to slow this initiative down? And what do we do, whether that's in companies that are trying to act, individuals that are trying to act?
Well, I think the gas pushback comes down to 3 letters, CCS. And that is the battle that is on the horizon now. Certainly in Australia, our pitch in Madrid at the COP there, and it's certainly going to be our pitch with the UK COP, and in fact with the White House and John Kerry, is that we are trying to make carbon capture and storage work. Now, Australia had a big history of CCS in the coal industry. Mm-hmm. That basically failed. I think most people will now admit that was a money pit that we didn't get anything back for. But the real pressure now is to say we can make CCS work for the gas industry. And in particular, Australia is trying to argue we can make it happen with the hydrogen industry. We are at the moment putting money into so-called brown hydrogen, trying to make hydrogen from fossil fuels for export to Japan, saying we can bury it with, using CCS and we can contain the emissions. This fits into this pattern that we saw, that I illustrate a lot in the book, this pattern of delay. Come up with a plausible technology strategy that can not only keep the investment flowing, but try and keep the value of it flowing and attract large amounts of government money that goes into subsidizing this, to supporting this, and giving us a political narrative and an investor narrative for the gas industry. Now, on the other side of that, I think the problem for the renewable industry and for the climate activists is to say, what is the plausible alternative for the steel industry, for the aluminium industry, for all these industries that are A, both necessary, and B, have large workforces? And I think what Twiggy Forrest is doing, as Blair mentioned before, is trying to look at a way where you can power the important industries like steel and aluminium with green hydrogen or renewable energy, whatever. And that is really, I think, going to be a big battleground for our government, and I suspect for a lot of other governments around the world.
So Marion, you say carbon CCS, carbon capture and storage, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where is that deployed in Australia or worldwide? And does it work? Like, it sounds too good to be true.
Well, you're exactly right. So what's happened is that Australia, going way back to John Howard's time, and I outline this in the book, was an enthusiastic supporter of carbon capture and storage. And I think it's at some point, I don't know if the real money flowed, but at least on paper, we were putting $500 million worth of taxpayers' money into CCS for coal. And at that stage, we had the idea that you could actually capture carbon emissions from existing coal plants and bury them. And this, of course, proved to be so economically implausible that and even the coal companies finally had to let that die a short time ago. We're doing this with gas, and there's a big experiment off the west coast of Australia where they are trying to, in the so-called Gorgon project with Chevron, they are trying to do this. And the government will argue passionately here that this is working. The problem is there's been major technical difficulties there. It's adding to the cost. As we know, the cost of gas will have to go down because of all the gas that's going to be flooding onto the market and the pressure from renewables. Once again, you get back to this thing. It's scientifically, it's technically possible to do this, but has it got any economic sense behind it? That will be the problem.
And for anyone that's interested, the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute released a really good report at the end of last year, which deals with the technical elements of this and which also puts down quite good cost estimates, both for transport and for storage. There has been CCS in the United States dating back to early 1970s, like 1972. There are thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines to transport the gas around. It's mostly being used for so-called enhanced oil recovery, so getting more oil out of your oil well. So I'm slightly in two minds as to whether that's such a good thing. But the really practical question is exactly what you're driving at, which is the commercial dynamics of this. Now, Bill Gates has written a bit about this in his new book, and I've not read that, but he talks about a price prospectively of something like $200 a ton for capturing CO2 from the air, so-called direct air capture. The other estimates I've seen put the figures at between $200 and $600 a ton, which is an enormous amount compared to the current EU ETS price, which is a shade under 40 euros when I looked this afternoon. But here's the interesting thing. There are some areas where carbon capture is prospectively economic. So if you look at this report, it calls out the lime and cement industry, which makes up roughly 2/3 of all industrial process emissions, and it's something like 5 or 6% of all emissions. There is technology emerging which can capture CO2 prospectively economically. There is an Australian company, Calix, which has got some technology in this space. So you can't watch that. But the point is the economics make sense for that industry so long as you capture the gas and store it somewhere nearby. They don't make sense if you've got to transport it 2,000 miles. So storing gas in Australia will only make sense if you can make something else work. Most of the rest of the activity will happen where the CO2 can be stored. And we care about lime and cement just because we use something like 4.5 billion tons of it a year. It's after water, it's the second most used thing on the planet by humans. So I learned recently. So we should perhaps come back to this subject because we could talk about it for, in quite some detail. But Paul, far away, I know you're itching to ask a question there. I can see it in your eye.
I have a whole list of questions. I'd love to hear Blair and Marion and Mick Lubinskas is asking this question too. Where are the leaders? Where can Australia lead the way? What kind of capital is needed? So if carbon capture and storage or carbon sequestration, if those are visionary, or if Bill Gates's new nuclear plants are not yet ready for prime time, how do we get energy and how do we transport energy? Who are the innovators and the leaders, Blair, Marion?
Yeah, that's a great question from Mick there. Thank you, Mick.
Just two quick things. One is green hydrogen, large-scale renewable energy. Australia is really well placed because something you may not know is that our renewable energy is the cheapest in the world. So if you're looking at where to set up, we have the innovation technology, the technology itself, the trained people to do it, and cheap renewables. Why Twiggy Forest is looking abroad is a longer term perspective of where you could set up in developing countries. That would take a long time, but in the short term, certainly for experimental use, but even things like specific to transport is the big one. If we're going to figure out how to use airplanes and shipping on no carbon fuel sources or extremely low carbon fuel sources, then we're going to have to crack potentially the green hydrogen challenge there. It's probably where the most obvious urgent short-term solution might work. So here we are, Australia. Be great to have a little federal leadership in understanding that this could be our transformational economic moment for what next for our economy, but we're not getting any of that. If you haven't seen the Twiggy Boyer lecture, I recommend watching it. It's a game changer in thinking. So that's us versus other parts of the world. One thing just to point out in reference to CCS that I think is important to think about is it's not there. Like it's not even close to being there. It's outrageously expensive to develop. Meantime, we've got this thing called renewable energy and battery storage, and it's cheaper now than anywhere else in any other type of energy, including existing coal. So it's not even like just building new stuff comparatively. It's also now cheaper to use it to literally shut stuff down and start over again with distributed renewables and battery storage, in which case the whole notion of CCS becomes ridiculous because while it's potentially useful for certain types of industries that are very specific, it's right now when you're transforming all of how energy is used across every sector and you have a great alternative, why in the world would you invest in micronukes or CCS when the transformation is what's important and you're going to go with whatever the large scale transformed into thing is, and that's renewables and battery storage.
Yeah, so, and exactly, because those technologies they're just low cost and they're well understood and they're low risk, which is when I'm talking about CCS, I've specifically talked about lime and cement because 8% of world emissions are industrial process emissions, which are nothing to do with the energy that's used. That bit we've got to find something to do with, but it's only 8%. It's not the rest.
Yeah, and just wrapping that up, I just think it's important to also think that when things shift, they shift large scale and they move very quickly, and that's already happening with renewables and battery storage and EVs and everything electrified. So to say that now we're going to just push right up that hill and say let's keep gas and coal because we can do CCS is fiction. It's the unicorn in the room, needs to be called out again and again. And frankly, micro nukes and nukes in general as well, the most dangerous and most expensive kind of energy in the world. And dare I say, Marianne, love to hear your thought on this, when you go to talk to people in the Carbon Club, and also related to the Nukes Club, the only reason we have nuclear power is because of weapons. It was driven by 6 governments around the world because they wanted nuclear weapons. They spent a fortune. They did not do that for energy. If you were going to look at energy, there were a million things that were a whole lot easier and cheaper. And you cannot ensure nuclear power without the government doing it for you, because no sensible company, no insurance company is going to insure a nuclear plant. It's just too dangerous. So I turn it over to you, but I just think those 2 bits of fictional thinking really have to be called out. Let's not pretend these are real solutions that are commercially backed by large scale money. It's just not happening. It's not happening.
And I'm just going to just add one thing in here, which is I can remember I hosted a breakfast for James Cameron, the founder of Climate Change Capital in the UK. And this was in Australia, and it must be the best part of a decade ago now. And there was a senior executive from the oil and gas industry there, who shall remain nameless, who said, but people like petrol. And I can remember saying, do you know, I've never met anybody that had a glass of it on their mantelpiece. They don't. They like their cars to work and be reliable and all those sorts of things. But if you're sniffing petrol, you've got a really serious problem. And so I just wanted to switch this a little bit to the motor manufacturing industry, because, of course, a huge part of the CO2 that's being produced is in the transport sector. And we've seen 2 things. One, a bunch of big Japanese companies in January put their heads together and then announced publicly that they wanted the government not to target 24% by 2030, but more like 40 to 50%, which was pretty radical. And then at the slightly more microscopic level, you have Volkswagen, which is committed to 70 electric models by 2030 and selling over 20 million EVs by then. Toyota committed to 70% of all sales expected to be electric by 2030. Renault will have electric versions of every model by 2022. And I'm working down the world's largest car companies here. General Motors is now committed to 30 new global electric vehicles by 2025. And chatting to one of my friends in there a couple of weeks ago, there's some serious energy going in behind this. And then Hyundai, as I mentioned, launched the Ioniq 5, 23 global electric vehicles by 2025. And that group accounts for almost half of new vehicle sales. How does all this fit into the kind of political discussion?
Well, that's a really important question. We just had in Australia an EV policy roadmap, another roadmap rolled out a few weeks ago. And to say it was underwhelming is an exaggeration. It was frankly shocking, especially as it had come after the GM announcement and after the announcements in Europe as well by the car makers there. And I think we just don't get it here. But I thought that's a bit simplistic just to look at it as a kind of a knee-jerk response from our emissions reduction minister. I think what it's actually about, and here you get to the nub of the issue, it's about the fact that there's deep concern here about the stability of the electricity grid in the move to electric vehicles. If there is a serious, fast transition to electric vehicles, that does put enormous pressure on your grid, and you have to have your renewable transition worked out, and you have to have the backup, whether it's battery or other firming power, worked out. And that means you have to bite the bullet on the shift to clean energy. So electric vehicles are absolutely integrated with what you do with your electricity supply. And I think that's why our government's balking on this, because they know that you have to work out your energy system if you're going to embrace an EV policy seriously. And I'd like to ask both of you, Paul, Nigel, and Blair, how you think that's going to go in the US let alone Europe, but interestingly, especially in key US states.
Well, we should talk about Texas here. Paul, do you want to go first?
Well, there's many parts to Texas. The most famous of one recently, when some of the coldest weather hit Texas a couple weeks ago, and the entire grid was knocked out. Most electrical grids in the US are interconnected. My first job was at McKinsey in the energy practice, so I've actually know probably too much about this. And one of the unique aspects of the electrical grid in Texas is it is inside Texas. And the purpose of that is to isolate it from federal regulation, federal pricing, and federal interconnects. And the state policy, as of the past decade and a half or so, is to basically have a free-for-all and to have mainly spot pricing, day of pricing, hour of pricing, and not necessarily locked in pricing. And that became so grave an issue in delivery. So climate change, essentially cold front, knocks out not only the grid, but also the power plants, the thermal power plants, some renewable power plants, but essentially 20 plus gigawatts came offline. And when the power went out, the heat went off. And when the heat went off, the water pipes exploded. So some people, even some domestic violence shelters where some women were gathering for heat, had their legal documents spilled on from the exploding pipes of water, causing them ripple effects issues. So just cascading disaster, essentially, in Texas. And of course, political football now saying, we'll put up with 3 days of no water and to not have and no heat, to not have the federal government in our lives, which of course is ridiculous. So that's one issue. The interesting thing about Texas is there's a lot of wind power. And in the US, there are states like Iowa where 15% plus of the energy is from wind power. Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway has some investments, another billionaire, and he's a little bit quiet about it, but sort of has an increasing proportion of it. Not enough battery and storage. So I'm highly curious to get the latest update from South Australia, which Blair, Marianne, and Nigel might know, of the power walls that Elon Musk put in, because he also sought to put them into other hurricane in post-hurricane geographies like Puerto Rico and Haiti, and so the lack of that infrastructure, the lack of battery storage backup, and the lack of policy. So one other global sort of policy view is in Germany, if you produce your own power, you can sell it back onto the grid. And you can not only have independent power producers like you have in the US, but then you can make that a profit center. There are very few grids technologically, but policy and pricing wise, that permit that. And so if you create excess power, like here in California, if you create excess power in your own house, you cannot sell it back to the utility. That's just either, maybe you can store it if you come up with your own battery storage. So lots of layered issues here: technologies, weather and climate, policy, pricing, who can make money off of energy or not. So the general theme that we've just been applying to the world and to investment portfolios has been massively decentralized self-sufficiency, massively decentralized self-sufficient energy, massively self-sufficient power, healthcare, finances. So we just have to think not as much in a centralized way, but Nigel, like you had introduced up front, how do we have half kilowatt power production where we can be independent? We can have storage like Blair talked about, and maybe not only some carbon capture and storage like Marion's talked about, but like primary demand. How do we implement more energy efficiency? And that's the highest ROI. The highest ROI is never using energy. and using software and solutions for that. So that's sort of one.
Fantastic expert answer. Who knew that Paul was going to have quite so much detail, which is wonderful. And you touched on something there that is really important, and we would be remiss not to dive into now, which is, as Peter Mulheron has asked in the Q&A, to talk a little about demand side initiatives and reducing energy waste and so forth. And particularly in doing this, I'd like to talk about the agricultural sector, because of course the agricultural sector and land use more generally is a really significant contributor to CO2 emissions. And what are we going to do about that? There is an opportunity for the agricultural sector to do things that drive more, through biocapture, drive more capture of CO2 in soils. That can be quite profoundly effective. Simply reforesting some areas can be profoundly effective and reasonably cost efficient if you've already got the land and you've got water, which people often forget about. And the last part of this is then, as Chris Gassman has asked about, air mining or direct air capture is somehow part of this as well. So I don't know if Marion or Blair, you want to dive in and talk about that set of issues, because this is obviously another very big part of the equation here. But I'm sure there are some agricultural members of the Carbon Club. This is what I'm really trying to say.
Well, yeah, there certainly are. And I think one of the tragedies for Australia, frankly, is that they have been represented by the National Party here, which is the main coalition partner to the Liberal Party. They go into government together. The National Party is the minority party, but they have enormous sway over things like the climate change and water policy. And a number of high-profile National Party leaders and resources ministers, including the current one, are either climate skeptics or certainly what we would call lukewarmers, who want to delay and believe you can delay action on climate change. But on the other side of that, we have a serious issue with agriculture in Australia. The latest reports from our CSIRO, our chief government scientific body, is that we are going to see a collapse in water flows, stream flows through the Murray-Darling Basin, which is our food bowl, by 30% by the year 2020 because of rainfall reduction caused by climate change. Right now, both the scientific agencies and a number of the agricultural agencies are trying to look at where we can move agriculture in Australia to avoid the worst of climate change, whether it's our vineyards or whether it's cropping or whether it's fruit and fibre. We are facing severe problems because of this. Now, there have been, and I will please stand up for Australia on this side, there have been attempts here to seriously look at carbon farming, as it's called, about carbon storage in soil and actually paying for that. It's the one place the government is interested in a carbon price. There's big problems still, especially in counting and regulating such schemes. But I think, again, for Australia, as Blair mentioned before, we have a lot of opportunities in the switch to a clean energy economy, and this is really one. And I think this is one where we can certainly get some political unanimity on, where we can look to carbon storage in Australia, in the soils, in the replantings, in the reforestation programs. It won't by any means be enough, but it will be an important contributor.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I know I was looking at this recently, I just can't remember the numbers, but the cost of using reforestation to capture CO2 is reasonably competitive. It's in the kind of tens of dollars a ton. As I say, it depends very much on the availability of land. And of course, you need water for it to work. And you need then to be sure that those trees then stand for a long time and don't get logged by someone who decides they've got a better plan in 20 years. So Blair, what did you want to add to that?
It's certainly not my super area of expertise, but I'd say one of the challenges for Australia in this bizarre flip, it's the federal government that has led on the agricultural front and the states that have totally fallen down. allowing large-scale land clearing and not even considering what that means in the bigger picture of water protection, for instance, and habitat protection, let alone climate. So herein lies our challenge as a nation, right? We need leadership from the very top all the way down to council level, and it needs to be coordinated in a country that is utterly divided on the basis of a right agenda that is pro-fossil fuel, very much led by a Murdoch agenda. Our hands are tied. I mean, I would ask everyone in Australia to think about, if you stand back and look at that challenge, and it is not just a challenge for climate change, it's for our economy, education, health, every issue that we face. What are we going to do about it? I think you have to look to an independence model to break the balance of power in this country. I cannot see any other way that you're going to get the current coalition government or Labor, certainly not the National Party, to understand that it's not good enough to be living in a 1940s view of the world, and you are simply not doing a job of leading the country. So in which case do we need 15 independents like Azali Steggall with a very clear 5-point agenda that the government will literally have to change because people are forcing them on the basis of their electorates no longer supporting that old agenda in order to get the change we need. Agriculture is a classic one. I think farmers by and large in Australia want to be actively involved in the new no or low carbon economy. They're going to need help doing that. It's the same with energy. It's the same with large scale industry, manufacturing, things like tourism. We need leadership. We're going to need it because to, for instance, fix the grid in such a way that farmers in remote locations can produce large scale renewables as part of their business model and feed it in. They're going to need somebody to fix the grid. That has to happen federally. So I just ask everyone on the call to get active on what's happening in your own electorate. At the recent conference with independents, there are 81 electorates on that conference for 2 days. People have had it, but they're going to need large scale support, and they're going to need it from mainstream Australia to say enough is enough. We just saw the worst bushfire rip through this country and destroy whole communities like nothing the world has ever seen before.
I've seen similar things in California, obviously, about the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely right. But if you look at the square acreage, Australia, it's the size of South Korea burned in that fire. What will it take for us to demand real government leadership? Start thinking about it, folks, because it's on us. They're not going to do it on their own.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Patrick Siebert asked this question, what will it take to drive policy changes in Australia? And, I think this point, what can be done at the marginal, at the edge of politics? Because, of course, the situation in Australia is you have 150 seats in the lower house. The government currently has a majority of 1, if I have this right. So it's sort of 1. So the odd seat can make a really big difference. And indeed, the Parliament's been quite finely balanced. And Zali Steggall, who is my representative in my home suburb in Australia, replaced the previous Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, in that election. So and by a substantial margin. So it can be done.
Some additional levers of government. There's top level policy. We mentioned Jigar Shah, who was on ESGX a couple of weeks ago, who's now in charge of the loan program that created loans for Tesla and others. But one more silent, and Blair and Marianne, I think, are appreciators of this as well, is there's a price of the social cost of carbon. And so one of the changes that is rippling through the Biden administration in the US is that social cost of carbon went down under Trump, and it's back up and even higher than it was under Obama. And so that social cost of carbon goes into rulemaking and policy making from laws and executive orders. And so there's levers like that. So there's a bunch of different levers. And Jessica Margolin asked in the chat, what about who doesn't give up their electric vehicle car? What happened? Well, if you remember back in the post-2008 stimulus, the 2009 stimulus under Obama, we had cash for clunkers. And so we bought cars off the road that needed to be replaced. So there's many levers that can be put into place.
Yeah, and
question from Rodin on circular economy. So Marianne and Blair, how is circular economy playing a role? Is that official policy yet? Is it a vision? Is it a blueprint?
Well, I might flip that one to Blair for the big picture.
It's certainly the way we're going. Like you just see the trends in, and one thing I guess that I call it blended finance solutions, but people call them concessional finance, all kinds of things where you're going to look at how do you say you want to transform, for instance, to green hydrogen. That's not going to happen on investor driven and money alone. That's going to take collaborative efforts around research, how you roll it out, where it's done, how it's financed. The Bill Gates Foundation plus the World Bank plus private investors is likely to be the way that we will go to. How do we, and that's bringing us to a different kind of thinking about finance and circular economy. And I think that's great news. Community ownership of renewables is another example of you see that happening all over the world now. If you think of the benefits that you talk about, social capital of carbon, if you're invested as an owner in your local power station, you're going to do things very differently than if you just get a bill every month and you pay it. You're going to ask questions about cost, impact, jobs in the local economy, et cetera. It gets people actively involved in participating in the problem solving. So I see that as nothing but good, but it's going to take some open minds and hearts about sort of what this can mean for us, because that traditional model of just making as much money as you can, eventually the rubber hits the road in the circular economy approach at that idea of open-ended investment and open-ended profit. But I would say we probably should have started really seriously thinking about that 100 years ago, but hey, let's get to it now. It's not a bad thing to do while we're tackling the biggest threat we've ever faced.
Yes, certainly. I know we see in our work a lot more interest in these sorts of discussions, both within Australia and in the corporate sector and in other places around the world. It's still early days, and I think one thing I felt is there is real strength in numbers in trying to connect more people together who are doing this, with lots of these examples. It's already been done somewhere, so someone knows how to do it. Of course, that's part of what Paul and I have been trying to do with the ESGX Live, our COVID baby. So I encourage everybody, everybody who's been in this discussion today, please do, share this with others. And please, if you've got other things you want us to talk about, keep the questions coming in. We've had a few great ones so far.
Marion, will you tell the story about the Tony Abbott scripting from your book? Because it's my favorite thing from the Carbon Club.
And I'm just, which particular one?
When he, I think it was the Heartland Institute provided a good couple of lines, and the next day Tony Abbott was reading them out at
and I don't think he even knew they came from the Heartland Institute, which is amazing. But this is Nigel and Paul. This goes to this issue about how much back and forth there is between the US in particular and Australia on the pushback on carbon policy. And I have no doubt we are going to see it again as the pushback comes against the Biden administration over in the US on climate policy. I'm sure the same arguments will be mounted here. But when Kevin Rudd, our Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister, back in 2009 was trying to bring in a carbon price, there was an activist skeptic, climate change skeptic senator here in Australia called Cory Bernardi, very famous for his conservative activism, went over to the US and got introduced to Myron Ebel from your Competitive Enterprise Institute, to various people on the Heartland Institute, who were then, of course, pushing a climate skeptics campaign. Also, incidentally, got in to see Senator Inhofe, who was then fighting the Waxman bill in your US Congress. And I think even saw Jim Sensenbrenner as well. So he basically had all the input. And one of the key messages that was being put at the Heartland Institute and through people like Myron Ebel is, the one way to argue against climate change policy and climate pricing is just keep saying, it's a tax, it's a tax, it's a tax. This was, of course, being run through all the Tea Party organizations in the US at the time. And Cory Bernardi comes back here with this message, and it's the message that then opposition leader Tony Abbott used to propel himself into the prime ministership here. Whenever you talked about climate change, everything was just boiled down to it's a tax, it's a carbon tax, it's a tax on everything. And I remember talking to our then climate change minister, Penny Wong, who was the Kevin Rudd's climate change minister. And she said to me, they heard the leader of the senior member of the National Party, as he was then, Barnaby Joyce, get up in the Senate and use this expression for the first time. And her staffer turned to her and said, they've just found the line that will kill us. And, you know, the power of that workshopping that went on in all those Tea Party type, Republican type skeptic groups, it just flows back here so quickly. And similarly, of course, when Trump was elected, after he'd given that famous speech talking about pulling out of Paris, the first thing that happened was Tony Abbott was back on the backbench. He came out and started talking about Australia should pull out of Paris. The conservative think tank here, the Institute of Public Affairs, started running a campaign for Australia to pull out of Paris. So this back and forth is really important for us. What happens over there with the pushback by the fossil fuel industry, it's going to happen here.
Absolutely. So maybe I've got one eye on the clock here. We're almost out of time. So maybe just some very brief closing comments from each of Marion and Blair. And perhaps we can just focus a little bit on the lever of risk in the financial system. And Patrick Siebert asked this question, the change in mindset we've seen from the banks in Australia. And of course, we've seen banks around the world become much more assertive about this, apart from perhaps HSBC, that I'm not sure has said anything much at all publicly. So, but interested in your very quick views on that. And then Paul and I will wrap up, and thank you.
Thanks. My quick one would be, risk insurance, greater climate impacts, having a huge effect at the governance level, at the reporting level. TCFD is becoming universal as the one tool. The holy grail of reporting is TCFD. Canada, for instance, and New Zealand. New Zealand's made it mandatory for aid. Canada's made it mandatory for large-scale corporate aid under COVID. That sort of sent the signal along with Carney that that's the thing. That gives us a bit of a level playing field. Certainly you can abuse TCFD if you want to, but if you're going to spend all that money and time actually doing a TCFD report, you might as well really know what your climate risk is, and that's a good thing. I think I can't underestimate the importance of COP and what's really on the agenda there in November. It will dictate the future market thinking on climate. And so if that thinking is transformational and talking about acceleration and speed, that's the way the market will go, no holds barred, with, of course, the odd tobacco effort on behalf of the fossil fuel industry to delay and say it's not going to happen. But it becomes less and less relevant if the whole world just says we're off and away. The Biden election, the same. Once that happened and he came into office in January, hit the ground running with a climate agenda. It's a very different world, net zero across China, Korea, and Japan. So I guess optimism, I will leave you with that word because it's a completely different world than it was 6 months ago. It's all on the table now, and the chances and opportunities for investing or being part of this climate economy are huge and real. Pretty exciting time, and I wouldn't have said that is even possible 6 months ago. So I'm feeling a lot better about life, and I hope you all do too.
Absolutely. And we do plan to run some live broadcasts from Glasgow and COP26 later in the year. So we've got that to look forward to. Marion, perhaps from you, maybe the word of caution will be helpful to go with that, as we know that this is not a slam dunk. There are still some 600-pound gorillas that are going to try to interfere with the best laid plans.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I have never heard Blair sound so optimistic, guys. So
Yeah,
I
absolutely right.
think that
It's a rare
something
moment.
something must be going on. And look, I have to say, my view is shifting, but maybe because I come out of that world of political reporting, I'm slightly more cynical. I do see the one step forward, two steps back. But I guess I would leave you with this thought, which was a thought that really impressed me from the woman who was our last senior government energy bureaucrat here, oddly enough. But she was really invested, especially towards the end, in the transformation of our electricity grid. I think she probably left out of frustration. She wouldn't say that, but she went off to join Google in their AI division. Very smart woman. But I was listening to her speak to a room full of energy executives before she left. And one of the things that she said is her parting words to them were, we are the last generation that can prevent dangerous climate change. So think about that when you're making your investment decisions.
That has been absolutely fantastic. I know if we were doing this on Clubhouse, we would talk for another 4 hours and everyone would be very, very distracted. So let me just try to wrap up. And I was going to share just 3 facts with this beautiful, colourful background behind me, which comes from an Australian photographer by the name of Dusty Fox, or at least that's his website. We'll put it on the link, but it's dustyfoxphotography.com. Takes some stunning photographs and has kept me a little bit sane during COVID. And those 3 facts are these, and they all involve fives. The first is that last year, for the first time, net flows into ESG related funds in the US was just over 50 billion US dollars. That's more than twice the amount in 2019 and 10 times the amount in 2018. That's net flow. That's inflows minus the outflows, which is a huge number. The second thing is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Back in January, they reported for the first time over $500 billion flowing into the repositioning of the whole energy value chain. And that was up about 10% on the previous year, notwithstanding the fact that some things have been slowed down by COVID reducing demand for energy and slowing some projects down as a result. And then the third is that we talked a bit about in this discussion, the top car manufacturers accounting for half of all production are all committed to really significant electrification of their fleets. And these are 10-year decisions. A model lasts for 7 years. You decide what you're going to do several years ahead of that. You don't get partway through a model and throw it away and do something different. It's just not how the car industry works. So I think those things are all driving change and difficult to reverse. And with that, thank you both very much. And I will hand to Paul just to give us a quick heads up for our next episode.
Thanks, Nigel. And thank you very much, Marianne Wilkinson, and your book, The Carbon Club, which we put the link in the chat, and Blair Palese, who's part of climateandcapitalmedia.com, which is in the chat as well. Also, Blair, very active on social media, as well as traditional media, online, electronic media. So our next ESGX will be on March 30th. It's the time again for the Green Jobs Report. What we have found over the past year, it'll be a year of doing the monthly Green Jobs Report, is that in times of stress, that sustainable companies in industries rated sustainably protect more jobs, fire fewer people, and pay the ones who they're employing more. So we'll get the latest insight from that, and we'll dive into a deeper look into place-based impact investing. So Lauren Agnew, founder of the Bay Area Impact Investing Initiative, will share the results of more than a decade of a investing model based on place-based impact investing. She's also the author of the Place-Based Impact Investing chapter in the new Global Handbook of Impact Investing, which is on sale this week. Discounted price on Better World Books. So please check it out. And then Dr. Fadel Kaboub, Dr. Scott Fulweiler, and soon to be Dr. Amir Khalegi, once he completes his PhD, will lead the Green Jobs discussion. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Very interactive, engaging discussion, very constructive questioning about how we do this and where we go. Hope you enjoyed the solutions that we provided and the way to team up together across borders. As Marian said, it's up to us. So let's get moving. Let's put it into action. And let's put the solutions that Blair and Nigel and Marian described into action. All right, we'll look forward to seeing you again next time on ESGX. Thanks to Nick Gower, our producer. This is recorded if you want to share it. And don't forget to hit that bottom 3 dots in the bottom of the chat box if you'd like the links.